before House of the Dragon aired, there was a lot of discussion on Reddit and other online platforms about the impact of the hypothetical scenario wherein Rhaenyra Targaryen does indeed ascend to the Iron Throne uncontested and thus becomes the first ruling queen of Westeros, and what would exactly happen when her eldest child, Jace Velaryon, ascended to the throne. On the surface, this doesn't seem that big of a question, but when you stop and look a little deeper, it is a bigger deal than it first seems, as Rhaenyra's children with Rhaenor were members of House Velaryon, given that their father is supposedly Rhaenyra Vealryion. It creates a situation wherein technically the Targaryen dynasty would end with Rhaenyra, with it now passing to House Velaryon. I recall a lot of fans, when talking about the pros and cons of Rhaenyra versus Aegon II, consider the end of the Targaryen dynasty a point against Rhaenyra, and I must admit, the first time I read the book without really looking a lot deeper into it, this aspect of the conflict really did jump out at me. But what is important to remember is, in Fire and Blood, the issue really isn't touched upon in any way, so the pure existence of it comes from fans analysing the text and noticing the implications should Jace take the throne. My interpretation comes from the point of view that House Targaryen had never dealt with a situation up to that point where the succession of a ruling queen was about to occur. Thus, there wasn't really any plan in place in terms of what would happen in regards to the dynasty and who the ruling house would be in this situation when the ruling queen's children took the throne. It seemed to me when reading Fire and Blood that the betrothal of Baelor and Jace could have been a move to address this issue, meaning that a Targaryen would still be queen and their children would still have that parental link to both House Velaryon and Targaryen. But it still doesn't answer the question as to what would happen in terms of who the ruling family would be, and what would happen to House Targaryen in the aftermath of a Velaryon ascension to the Iron Throne. Given the nature of Fire and Blood as a history book, and the fact the idea of any of Rhaenyra's Velaryon children taking the throne becoming a non-issue, it never addresses the situation directly. But I do enjoy an alternative timeline where House Velaryon does actually become the ruling house, and House Targaryen become, what, Lords of Dragonstone once more? But why did fans assume the ruling house would change to that of Rhaenor's in this situation? Well, there are cases in the lore of Westeros wherein a ruling lady marries, with her children taking their father's name. Thus, when the titles and lands pass to them, the name of the house changes as a result. But at the same time, this is not a hard and fast rule, with there being cases in the main books of matrilineal marriages, where the husband will assume the name of his wife's house. Thus, their children will have their mother's family name. This seems to be done when the ruling lady is marrying a man from a lesser house with less prestige, or in situations where the house could die out if the lady is in fact the last of her line. What becomes clear when investigating this matter further, there is no hard laws about this, and it all seems to depend on how the marriage pact was negotiated and the power balance between the two families. I think people assumed House Velaryon would become the ruling house, as Fire and Blood gives us no indication of what the plan was or how the marriage was negotiated, or even if it was to be a matrilineal marriage. Even I question this when reading Fire and Blood for the first time, that surely if such a deal was made, there would have been some sort of historical record of it. That surely Jace would already be known as Jace Targaryen, if that was the deal. And this is where House of the Dragon comes in. I didn't expect them to address this issue, as in all honesty, let's face it, it is rather minor in the grand scheme of things, and becomes very much a non-issue as the story progresses. But I was actually pleasantly surprised they did address it. In the show, King Viserys travels to Driftmark to negotiate a marriage pact with Corlys Velaryon in regards to a marriage between Rhaenyra and Rhaenor. Of course, Corlys Velaryon, being an ambitious man, was keen on the idea of his son perhaps becoming the king consort, with his grandson on the Iron Throne. House of the Dragon perfectly shows negotiation of such a pact, and how power balance between the families is important. Viserys' caveat to the marriage is that when Rhaenyra and Rhaenor's eldest child ascends the Iron Throne, they would do so under the name Targaryen. So in practice, this means that Jace Velaryon would become King Jace I Targaryen. Rhaenyra and Rhaenor's second son would then become Lord of Driftmark, keeping the Velaryon name, rather than Jace holding both titles, which he technically would be entitled to, which in turn would then remove House Velaryon as the Lords of Driftmark. Corlys agrees to this, and thus it prevents the end of the Targaryen dynasty in name. While we know that George R. R. Martin is deeply involved with the show, and has confirmed aspects such as Aegon's prophecy do apply to the books, we don't know if this idea of Jace taking the name Targaryen also applies to the books. But what it does show is there is a functional way in the book in which the throne can pass to Rhaenyra without it being the end of the Targaryen dynasty. When you look back at this with the newly added context from the show, while it might not be documented in Fire and Blood or any history book, I think it does seem likely to me. Something to the effect of what is shown in House of the Dragon probably did occur in the books too, be that Jace taking the name Targaryen or some other method of preserving the Targaryen dynasty. Viserys had his flaws as king and made some big errors during his reign. I don't think an issue like this is something he would overlook and just allow to happen.